Bonjour, everybody. Audrianna Goodwin, Nijitkas, Washkubanesi Queen Indigo, Mayangan Indudem, Misquagami Wezagunning Indunjaba. Greetings, everybody. It is an honor to be in this space with you all, creating this space. My colonized name is Audrianna Goodwin. I'm known to the spirits as Blue Thunderbird Woman. I'm a part of the Wolf Clan, and I'm a citizen of the Great Red Lake Nation. I will start this panel by, talking a little bit about myself and my journey to this point. As Indigenous women, as Indigenous peoples, we all have our own stories of this colonial violence that has been perpetuated in our communities. Wanting to take a moment to honor the missing loved ones that are still out there. Sheila St. Clair, Nevaeh Kingbird, Jeremy Jordan, and so many countless others that are still missing. And we're in this space at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This is a world-renowned institution. We educate the world leaders of today, and to have this space, to have this moment, as so many other panelists and speakers have mentioned before me, these spaces weren't created or intended for us, but here we are, making our ancestors proud. We're carrying our ancestors in this space. We're indigenizing this space. I've been a student here at the Humphrey School for 2 years now, and this is one of 2 times where we held this space. All of our beautiful faces when we were standing outside smoking our cigarettes, knowing that the university has a no smoking policy, but it's our space to take it, right? This is our homeland, and that's indigeneity. That's who we are, right? And even through all of the sadness, and I was brought to tears by Lieutenant Governor Flanagan's words, brought to tears that her experience. You guys are still here. I thought you were all dead, right? We all have our own stories. My best friend Anne, for her vulnerability and sharing her story of her trauma. The wisdom of Grandma Mary Lyons in smudging and in those teachings. And we had the opportunity to share with one of our fellow Humphrey students some of those teachings. He came to us in a good way and asked to be smudged down. And that's what being Indigenous is about. And so I just wanted to take those few moments to start the panel off in this way. And also wanted to mention that we as a team of organizers, we're really intentional about this space for remembering why we are engaged in this policy work. I carry you all with me. I see you and me and me and you. When I look at all of your beautiful faces in the crowd and all of the people that are watching today. And so really just wanting to remember and center why we're doing what we're doing, why we're advocating for systems change. And at this time, I would like these distinguished guests, these panelists, to briefly introduce themselves. I'd like to start off with Juliet, please. Miigwech.
Hello, everybody. I'm Juliet Rudie. I'm the new director of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. The office falls under the Department of Public Safety, Office of Justice Programs. The MMIR office is a direct result of the MMIW task force and the legislation that was passed. I'm a Lower Sioux tribal member. I bring 28 years of experience in law enforcement. I worked 9 years as a patrol officer with the St. Paul Police Department, and then 12 years as a sergeant in working in many, many different units, juvenile investigations, missing persons, internal affairs, and then eventually I landed in the director of training position. After that, I went over to the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office in 2011 for 7 years. I was the inspector and the undersheriff of administration, and then ended up working as the chief deputy. I'm also a mother, a wife, and a grandmother. I have 11 grandchildren. And this work is very personal to me. I have a cousin that's been missing since 2007 or 2017. His name is Mato Dao. He's on the list. I have a cousin that was murdered with no justice. And I have a friend that worked in law enforcement with me. He passed away, but before he passed away, his daughter died from gun violence. And he said to me when we were working together on the Native American Law Enforcement Summit, it was a conference that we get together, law enforcement officers, tribal law enforcement officers around the state. And he said, Julie, we need to do more. And so that's why I do this work. That's why I'm doing this work, is because we need to do more.
We go to Allison for introducing yourself. John, if you'd like to go next.
Hi there, my name is John Roesler. I'm an epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health, and I work in the injury and violence prevention section, which includes more than just injury and violence. We also have alcohol epidemiology and occupational health, which goes beyond injury and violence. I've been an epidemiologist since I graduated from grad school. Went first to work for the North Dakota Department of Health, and then came to the Minnesota Department of Health. Worked in diabetes for many years, and then in 1992 switched over to injury epidemiology with traumatic brain injury, and then increasingly involved with violence-related issues, both fatal and non-fatal. Currently, I'm the principal investigator for the Minnesota Violent Death Reporting System. Also the principal investigator for the sudden unexpected infant death and sudden death in the young. Also co-investigator for the state injury prevention program and some other projects as well. So this is the work, our epidemiologic analysis, and working to provide the statistics and the background, identifying various issues and disparities on this. Yeah.
Let me switch, John. Brian, if you could go next.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Pottratz. I'm an investigator with the Leech Lake Tribal Police Department. I'm not sure how I ended up with this distinguished panel and me on here, so you'll have to bear with me. I've been a cop for 10 years. I started in 2013 working with the Upper Sioux Community Police Department and worked there for about 3.5 to 4 years, and then moved to the Leech Lake Tribal Police Department. I originally grew up in Bemidji, and Leech Lake is very close to where I grew up. Have worked there for since 2017 in a various patrol. And in 2018, I was asked to move into the investigator role at the time, it was a newly created investigator position of sex trafficking. And I didn't have any clue what that was. I was a dumb flatfoot that I went out and pulled over speeders and was like, oh, okay, that sounds fun. Since then, I have learned a great deal and realized that there is an extreme issue in the state regarding this human and sex trafficking. I also work with the Trust Task Force, which is the Native Tribal Task Force. We have representation specifically from 7 of the 11 tribes and have working relationships with the other 4. Sorry, I'm a cop, I don't do math. You can feel free to laugh. I'm trying up here. I'm really trying. I also have a working relationship with the agent from the BIA, which is he's in the MMU unit, which is the missing and murdered unit. He's currently assisting me on a couple of different cases, and I have a extremely good working relationship with the BCA. We have done several operations and throughout the state regarding sex trafficking operations. And I guess that's about all I can think of.
Thanks, Brian. Allison, if you could go next. Miigwech.
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry to not be able to be there with you in person and share in community with all of you. Joining you from Washington, D.C., the ancestral land of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan peoples and the Piscataway peoples. And I'm the Principal Deputy Director for the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice. And this is an issue that we're incredibly passionate about and that we're honored to work in partnership with tribes to address. I came from direct service work, back in the 90s, working in shelters and programs, working with survivors, seeing folks run into the same problems again and again. So I came to Washington, D.C. in 2000 to start policy work and worked in nonprofits, and then went to Health and Human Services and the White House and the Department of Justice. I went back for a little while to the nonprofit world, and so I've been back at the Office on Violence Against Women as the Principal Deputy Director for going on a year. And again, it's such an honor to be with this panel and with all of you virtually.
Miigwech, Allison. One of the intentions of this panel is to really start to look at some of, the barriers and the holes and the way in which we can collaborate between all of these systems, the tribal, state, and federal systems. And so again, really being intentional about the space and the people that we've invited. So again, Miigwech for joining us today. And we'll transition now into some of the questions that I have prepared. So I guess if John could go first, and I'll ask all of the panelists these same questions. And we've already kind of touched a little bit on it through the introductions, but now just expanding more on some of those thoughts. Can you share with us, from your perspective, the issue of missing murdered Indigenous relatives and the roles in which your involvement is in this, and what brought you to doing this important work?
Yeah, so I can talk, I'll go backwards there. I'll start with, what brought me into this. Probably the first thing is when I, the first house I was ever able to purchase was it was part of an urban Indian housing project. And they had room for 2 white families in the urban Indian housing project. And my wife and I, and then our daughter, who was born while we were living there, came into this community, and actually brought back memories. I was trying to remember who was there, and I thought with Audrianna, I remembered then Mike Goodwin was my neighbor there. So the Goodwin brought back a good memory for me. But from there, then I was in grad school, and after that began working in diabetes. And when you work in the area of diabetes, you're going to work with the American Indian community. And I did that up in North Dakota. And that brought me into relationships. Also, as I was living in the urban Indian housing project in South Minneapolis, I became a big brother to 2 American Indian boys, and maintained a relationship into adulthood with them. Unfortunately, they have both passed. And that's just been part of our journey together. Now, as I begin to work areas in violence, and one of the things that, again, really raised issues with this was as we started dealing with the drug overdose epidemic that's going on, and which overlaps with this issue. Because when we first started generating the numbers, well, Minnesota had relatively low rates. We weren't even eligible to apply for some of the federal funding that was going on. Yet there was one very notable statistic that stood out. And we looked at the race-rate disparity ratios, which is the rate of drug overdose deaths in various racial populations compared to white or majority population. And the race-rate disparity ratio for American Indians in Minnesota was the highest in the nation. Minnesota has good health, but this health has not been shared. There's no coattail effect on this. The American Indian population in Minnesota has not been able to benefit from what is for most Minnesota residents, good health. And this really stood out when we looked at the race rate disparity ratios for drug overdose. The race rate disparity ratio was the highest in the nation. Any racial group, any state, this was just incredible. And so we kept trying to bring this, forward, and we continue to do so. This is not dissimilar to other mortality issues that we deal with. Now, I'm also the sexual violence epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health, and we have very meager resources for this. There's not really money to hire a full-time epidemiologist, and so my time for the most part is contributed from other funding sources that I have. But this is one of the areas that we try to make some difference on with the Minnesota Safe Harbor program, which deals with sexual exploitation, girls who are being sexually exploited, including sex trafficking, but even going beyond the sex trafficking, and providing them with resources so that they can get out of being sexually exploited. So I've been working on trying to generate some of those numbers, and this is what brings me into this issue, first with the sexual exploitation, and then as I became principal investigator for the Minnesota Violent Death Reporting System, we investigate all homicides, suicide, gun deaths, undetermined deaths, and we also investigate all drug overdose deaths with a related program, the State Unintentional Drug Overdose Reporting System. So all these deaths are investigated by us, and we also look at the accompanying statistics that go with that. And of course, the American Indian numbers, the rates are horrendous on this. Pick whatever your favorite cause of death is on it, and the American Indian population will have the highest rates. That's almost a truism across the board. So having given my background in working with the American Indian community, this has been a topic that I've been trying to continue to bring to the forefront where I have the opportunity and when I have share statistics. So this is part of what brought me into this. And again, I think I don't have the answers to these problems, but I'm more of the counter on this whole thing. And the opportunity that I have is to bring the statistics forward to the community so this remains a topic of discussion. So that's been my role with MMIW, and also bringing a public health perspective. A lot of this comes in from a criminal justice perspective, which is very appropriate, but I also try to bring public health to the table on this and bring a public health orientation, which in part brings more of a upstream focus. How could these have been prevented a lot further upstream? What were some of the long-term antecedents that resulted in people becoming missing or murdered, et cetera? Okay, thank you.
Yes, Miigwech. For some of the listeners and even some of those in the room, can you kind of give a little breakdown of what epidemiology is? Yeah, just briefly. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so epidemiology comes from a couple Greek words, epi, which is upon, and demos, the people. So it's what is upon the people. And epidemiology is then the study of disease in our society, which includes homicides, suicides, et cetera, and also non-fatal events with that. So we work in epidemiology to describe and also look at risk factors and protective factors associated with various diseases.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Brian next.
Sure.
Do you want me to repeat the question? Or?
If they're the same ones you sent us, I have
Yes,
them written
same
down,
ones.
so I won't have you read them. I'm not gonna lie, I had to Google what he does because I had no idea. I'm like, what is that? What brought me into this work? I'll kind of do the same thing. And starting backwards, what brought me into this work was growing up just outside of Bemidji. I had a lot of Native friends that went to school with and stuff like that, and never really learned about their culture. It wasn't a matter of, and maybe it was my fault that I didn't ask questions, but it didn't really come up as a topic. We were just friends. And so I really didn't know a lot about the culture starting out. And for those that, if you can believe it, I used to have hair halfway down my back and was going to be a musician, and realized that doesn't pay the bills. So I decided to get into law enforcement, and I started work with the Upper Sioux community. And one of the first things that I jumped out, and I remember this question clearly when I was talking to the chief, and I said, how come there's not any, do you have any Native officers working for your tribal department? Nope. Why? It seems like they would, you should be working in your own community. And one of the things that I learned is that, a lot of times those community members that were going to go into law enforcement or go into something else would leave the reservation and go somewhere else and work. And that didn't make any sense to me. It's why would you leave? This is where the issue is. Why would we not try to solve the issue where the problem is and go to somewhere else? And that's always kind of stuck in the back of my head of in my law enforcement career. The roles in which your involvement in this, a lot of it comes from working with the trust task force and going around the state and doing different what's the word I'm looking for, stings, for lack of a better word, and seeing the issue that's going on. I can tell you that I can't really talk a lot about how we do those or what goes into those, but I can tell you that our last operation we conducted in I believe it was in the metro area, in the space of 11 hours, we started at 11 a.m. and we went till 11 p.m. In the space of 11 hours, we had 200 people respond to the ad that we posted. We ended up catching, I believe, 5 of them, and that was for a juvenile sting. We were pretending to be a 15-year-old female, and that is appalling. This is not an ad that we're putting out on Facebook or something like that. These are specific sites that we're putting these sites on, or the ads on, and you don't go to these ads without knowing what you're going to look for. So to have 200 people answer, and there was, if I remember correctly, we had 20 within the first 2 hours. That is shocking to me. That, and this is starting at 11 o'clock. So you can imagine that these, the people that are out there doing this kind of stuff are looking constantly. I don't know if they have an alarm on their phone or how it works, but they're constantly looking at these ads and they're bringing this stuff up. And it's an extremely eye-opening experience to be a part of these operations and to deal with the mentality and that kind of stuff. As far as the perspective, of the issue with MMIR, I guess I don't know that I have an opinion. I don't know that I have an answer for that question. We were sent these questions earlier this week, and I've been pondering that one for quite a while. It's a multifaceted problem. There's not a Band-Aid that can go on this. And one of the things that I keep seeing is money being thrown at stuff. We'll throw money at this, we'll throw money at that, we'll throw money at this. We'll try to get this stuff, we'll try to get that stuff. And I'm not saying that's not the right thing to do, but I don't believe in throwing money at a problem. I think we have to get into the trenches and we have to start digging, and we gotta help everybody out. And I know I started with labs, so I'm trying to end with labs. So I have been doing this a long time, and it's an extremely dark and an extremely troubling subject. As a law enforcement officer, I speak 2 languages. I speak sarcasm and I speak swearing. So if 1 or 2 of those pop out, I apologize. I try to keep it under wraps, but I tend to get blue sometimes. So it's tough. It really is. Going to these calls, going to doing investigations on people. I've been working on, I saw the flyer for Damon Boyd. I've been working that case for the last 4 years and have been working with his grandfather. And it kills me to go out there and speak with him and talk with him and not have any new information for him. And we follow every lead we can. We dig and we dig and we dig and we keep going. And I'm going back over things that we've already done just to make sure we didn't miss anything. And it kills me that I see him just sitting in his house and he tells me over and over again that he has been sitting in front of this computer for 8 years waiting for an answer. And I think he literally does that. He sits in front of his computer and his phone and he just waits for answers. And I'm trying to do everything possible in my power to give him those answers, whether it's a solid lead or if it's even just, a whim. I will go and I'll chase it down to figure it out because I want him to have closure. Nobody should have to live like that. And the more that I do this, the more people I realize are living like this, and it's not okay. So now that I brought the entire group down, we'll stop the answers.
Thank you, Brian. Allison, if you could go next, please.
Thank you. So the Office on Violence Against Women at DOJ, kind of responds to these issues in multiple ways. Overall, we address domestic violence and sexual assault and dating violence and stalking, which is, so interconnected with the issues of, missing and murdered Indigenous people, women particularly, but all missing and murdered Indigenous people. And we fund about $500 million in grants that go all across the country and that go to, dozens of tribes every year to support a range of work. And then we also do, policy work and federal leadership. And one of the most important things that we do in all of this work is to consult with tribes. And so every year we have a government to government consultation with tribal leaders. And we include other folks from the Department of Justice and the Departments of Interior and Health and Human Services to meaningfully consult on what we at DOJ and at these other agencies should be doing. And, we hear a lot about MMIP and just last year we heard heartbreaking testimony from far too many tribal leaders who had lost a loved one or who didn't know if someone missing would ever return. And one thing that stuck with me was Vice Chairwoman Wendy Schlater from the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians, who said, truths can be hard to share and hard to hear. But it's important that we hear that and be led by that. So all of our work in our office is guided by the principle that we can't end violence against American Indian and Alaska Native people without respect for tribal sovereignty and listening to tribal leaders and communities when we develop and carry out any responses, right? Our work is only going to be effective when it's informed by tribal leaders. And what we want to do is empower tribes to do what tribes know they need, right? You know what is best needed in your community. Every tribe is distinct and different. And so what we do is, provide funding, provide support for tribes to respond. Addressing the disproportionately high rates of violence that we're hearing folks talk about experienced by Native Americans and the high rates of Indigenous persons who are reported missing is a priority, not just for, my office, but for the whole Department of Justice. And it's really amazing to hear, this panel speak about, the public health and the public safety concerns, because we have to have that intersection. And then it has to be trauma informed. It has to be survivor centered. One of the things that we're doing just this week, the department launched a new web page to kind of center a lot of our resources on kind of the department's response to missing and murdered Indigenous persons. It has a lot of resources for survivors and loved ones, communities, law enforcement. So check that out. That's on the DOJ webpage. We can maybe post that link in the chat for you. And we're also, doing ongoing consultation, right? There's the big consultation that we do, but it's not just us. Just last month, the Department of Justice held government-to-government consultations specifically on the unacceptably high rates of violence in Native communities, including rates of missing or murdered Indigenous persons. And we're trying to tackle this at a senior level, right? So, in November of last year, President Biden signed an executive order aimed at improving public safety and criminal justice for American Indian and Alaska Native people including by addressing MMIP. And that directs many of us, DOJ, but also Departments of Interior, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security, to work with tribes to promote safety in Native communities and to build and lift up the work already underway at DOJ. So, our Deputy Attorney General then launched a steering committee to address the crisis, and in consultation with, it's always got to be in consultation with tribal leaders and stakeholders. They're reviewing all the department's guidance and policies and practices to address missing and murdered Indigenous persons and developing a comprehensive plan. And I'll just end with saying, we just know there's so much more to do. And, our department Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, in her directive creating that steering committee, said, that the department recognizes that challenges faced by tribes are best met by tribal solutions, and that the steering committee should therefore make tribal engagement the cornerstone of its work. So that's, I think for us, what we see is, how do we take key next steps? How do we make meaningful progress? It's got to be together. It's got to be through partnerships. It's got to be through supporting and empowering tribes and supporting tribal sovereignty.
Miigwech, Allison, for your words. Juliet, if you could go next, please. Thank you.
In 2017, I retired from law enforcement, and I told my husband, I said, I need to do more. And so when this position was posted and became available, I applied, because I told him I need to do more for women, Native women, and children. And so I read the report. It's 163 pages that was done by the Wilder Research and on behalf of the task force. And I was very impressed with the amount of work that went into that report, and then the amount of people that worked on it. I mean, it was a bipartisan effort. Plus, it included law enforcement, judges, federal, state, and local law enforcement, advocacy groups, including John's office, and all the data. And I was so impressed, because it took a large group of people that got together, and they actually got this work done. And it laid the foundation for the work that I'm going to do. And like I said, so the task force recommended, one of the first recommendations was the MMIR director position. Now it will be my job to work with the 11 tribal nations, Native urban community organizations, advocacy groups, all the stakeholders, and come up with solutions to address MMIR. So I'm working on developing an advisory council that will be able to help me move forward with this work. And I don't want to go further on, because you're asking me questions that I'm going to answer later.
Okay.
And so,
Okay.
so it was, because I had talked a little bit about why I am doing this work. Like I said, it's very personal to me, and it's a big job, but it's important that the community work together to help solve this issue. And I was visiting with Jack Rice, and he was the attorney for the people that pulled the Columbus statue down. And he brought a group of people together in a restorative justice process. And this is what we're going to have to do together. The community and all these organizations, we're going to have to work together. And it's really a restorative justice, a community restorative justice process to help with this epidemic and injustice.
Miigwech. You know, it was really important for me to ask those first couple introductory questions. I think it's important too for Indigenous communities to know why you're engaged in this work, right? We always ask, where are you from? Where's your family? Those kinds of things. It's just one of those Indigenous things that we do. And so I wanted to thank you all for opening up a little bit to be vulnerable in this space and to share, you know, those personal stories of you, even your loved ones that are, you know, personally. And so all of these things. And so the next question that I have for the panelists is, since being engaged in this work in various capacities, in your professional opinion, what is the biggest barrier you see that needs to be addressed to create change? Do you have any recommendations in addressing this issue? I know that's a pretty loaded question, and I know that we've kind of already started to dig into it, but really wanting to dig deeper now. And so I would like to ask Brian to go.
I guess my number came up. Sorry, again, it's that humor. I'm trying to keep the darkness away a little bit. I mentioned it before. It's a multifaceted problem. Some of the biggest barriers that I think that I have run into is communication, not necessarily just between departments, but between agencies, between different entities in the state. And that conversation has started and that's beginning to happen, which is phenomenal. It's still in its infancy stage, but it's kind of learning to go right now. The other part of that I think is an issue is accountability. Being accountable, being held to, this is your job, we need to get this done. And you can put it any number of different ways, but at the end of the day, I take it personally that it's my job to find Damon. It's my job to find the people that I am working with on trying to find their loved ones. Just as a quick statistic, in 2021, I worked on 72 runaways in the Leech Lake Reservation. That is just the reservation. That is not the outlying communities. That is just stuff that came into my office that we worked on. And I think that's kind of the beginning. We had touched a little bit on it. I had overheard a conversation in one of the previous panels about issues with ICWA and different things like that. That can be a huge thing as well. You're taking a community member out and you're putting them into a different situation that they're not specifically used to. The kid's going to run, and that starts the path, because once that running starts, then they learn how to live on the street, how to do things on their own, how to survive on their own without assistance. And that starts the path, in my opinion. And so when I'm dealing with these runaways and I'm when I track them down and different things like that, I talk to them. What are you running for? I had one girl alone run 6 times last year in the span of about 3 months. And I sat down with her and was like, what are you running for? What's going on? Obviously there's something more happening here. We need to dig into the problem of what is causing you to run, because now you're putting yourself into the system, and that is the path that leads to a dark area, and you don't want to go there. So let's work on why you're running. What is going on? And over a number of conversations, we slowly started working through the issues and working through that problems. And I have since not had a run report with her since. So that to me is a win. And law enforcement is a tricky job. If you think about it, as an officer, I'm trying to work myself out of a job. If I can solve all the problems, if I can solve all the crimes, then I don't have a job anymore, and I can go off and do other things, or I'll do other things, but the job never ends. And if we can slowly take steps in that communication, in that accountability, and just responsibility and holding that accountability, I think that's going to be a big part of the problem, and a big part of a solution to the problem. Sorry, I tend to ramble, so I apologize.
No, thank you, Brian. I think it's really important that you bring up the issue of communication, and, thank you for sharing that story. Although, we have differences or perceived differences, we all love and grieve in same or similar ways, and we all have that connection as human beings. So taking that a few extra moments to speak to this young girl really mattered. And helping her overcome running away and those kinds of things. So Miigwech, thank you. Alice, or if you could go next, Juliet, please.
So when I read the report, the thing that stood out the most to me was the findings, and that colonialism, racism, and the objectification of women are causing MMIR. And I was like, okay, so the task force came up with 5 requirements and 20 mandates on how we could help solve this epidemic and injustice. And it seems overwhelming, but we need to do something, and we need to do more. And I think the most overwhelming part of it for me is the systemic racism and the systems and changing systems. And it takes time. And I'm really impatient sometimes. It's like, come on, we need to get stuff done, and we need to work together and move forward. And so I'm very determined to work in the community to try and make a difference. And we need to bring attention to MMIR injustice. We have to educate our Native communities, and we have to educate the public and public safety agencies and hospitals, hotel staff, how to recognize what's going on with human trafficking. And then part of plans that I want to put in place are developing prevention and reporting and follow up for public safety. I think that's going to be very important. And then to help change issues that are going on in law enforcement as far as reporting. And, in the state of Minnesota, you don't get to say no, or the law enforcement doesn't get to say no to taking a report. When somebody is missing, they absolutely have to take a report. And people sometimes are put off that, oh, you got to wait 24 hours. There's no 24-hour rule. When somebody is missing, law enforcement must take a report, and they must act on it. And so educating people about that kind of stuff, I think, is going to be very important too. Educating the public on that. And I believe in the mission of this office and seeking justice for victims and their families, and then promoting the empowerment of Native women, children, and relatives is personally important to me, in that that's what I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do. And I think that if we can get the community to work together, I think we can make a difference. I mean, we have to do something. And I think there's a lot of good work that's going on out there already, with Safe Harbor, with their options for shelter. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of different community groups, and there is good work going on out there, but we need to do better.
And I think that's the same for so many of us in that room, in this room and in this space. We have that hope that things can change, that things can get better. And so thank you for sharing with us. John, if you could go next, please.
Sure. One of the challenges that I'm always up against is small numbers. The American Indian population is 1% of the state's population. You could take American Indians out of the statistics of the state's homicides, the state's suicides, the drug overdose deaths, and you would hardly notice a change in that. And that becomes a little bit difficult in telling the story, because when we begin to calculate the rates, we go, well, this is very different, because the rates are the highest in the American Indian community. They carry the biggest burden with regards to this. But this is one of the challenges that I'm always working against. And even I was prepping a little bit for today, and I'm trying to run some numbers on American Indian women, the cause of death, et cetera. The numbers are small. And on any given year, some of the number generators, I was working with CDC Wonder, and it doesn't kick out numbers because the numbers are smaller than 10 in a given year. And so we end up having to aggregate and employ some other methodologies that do allow us to get beyond the small numbers, because the rates are huge with this. And that's one of our challenges from a public health perspective. How do you tell a story when the numbers are small, but the rates are high? But that's what epidemiology also brings to the table as we describe this, is because we know how to work with the rates. We know how to describe these problems. We know how to describe disparities, because, and just to be honest, you know, with epidemiology, if there were no disparities, epidemiologists wouldn't have a job. You know, everyone would have the same risk of everything. And obviously that's not true. Our job as epidemiologists is to identify the disparities and identify the causes for those disparities. So, but small numbers.
Thank you. Allison?
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think there's so many key things, and I just really want to lift up and focus on what Juliet said, right? Lifting up the report that colonization is a root cause to so many of, not just of what's leading to our crisis with MMIR, but that it's also a barrier to change. We're looking at historical trauma and racism, and that sexual objectification of Indigenous women and girls. And similarly, many of the conditions that perpetuate violence against women are barriers in this context as well. And that can be poverty and lack of housing and homelessness, barriers to education or employment or economic security or healthcare. These can all have compounding effects, and it can be hard to make progress. It can be hard to have trust in any of the systems, right? When systems haven't done right by you, to have that trust is really challenging. And so our responses have to take into account that historical trauma and that racism. They have to take into account, holistic support for folks. And, our role in our office is really to fund the work that you all and others are doing to address domestic violence and sexual assaults, and, across DOJ looking at MMIR. I just want to note that, like Brian talked about, working with runaways, helping folks who are vulnerable. I myself, when I was a kid, ran away from home, and law enforcement, when they eventually picked me up some weeks later, took me to a domestic violence shelter instead of to jail, and spoke with me. And, that changed my whole life, right? So we really want to support the individual life-changing and the systems-changing work that you and others are doing on the ground. And one way that we do this is to fund services and responses that are by and for tribal communities, not for tribal communities, by and for tribal communities. So funding that's, culturally specific, community-based, tribal organizations, tribal governments. And that kind of funding is critically important because those organizations understand the complex challenges that survivors face, and they understand what are the resources, what are all of those places of community resiliency to tap into, what are the systems that need to change, and how do you really change those systems. So those tribal organizations, culturally specific organizations, are really capable of addressing and responding to challenges and meeting survivors where they are. One of the many ways we do this is through our Tribal Coalitions program that builds the capacity of survivors and advocates and tribal organizations. The Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition comes to mind. They've done tremendous work in this intersection, particularly around trafficking and sex trafficking of Indian women. So we want to encourage all of you to, look out for our grant funding, other Department of Justice grant funding, look for ways that we can support you and use resources to fund, whether that's that law enforcement response or those services responses or that research that you're doing.
Thank you, Allison, for your words. And then to transition now to the last question that I have for you all. Are there any current initiatives that are currently taking place that you would like to share? I'm going to start off with Brian, actually.
Twice, really? I guess I have a few that I can talk about a little bit. One of the initiatives that I've been putting together is doing hotel and security staff training regarding human trafficking, regarding the signs and symptoms, different things like that. Because half the battle to me is knowing what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to see it. And I know the state made it mandatory for all hotels to conduct human trafficking training. So I went through the MDH and got my presentation approved, and I'm happy actually to report that I just got post approval for it as well, which is the law enforcement board. So I can now give law enforcement an hour credit for training on this as well. So that was easier than I thought it was going to be, but a little harder than it needed to be. And I'm also currently working on a presentation specifically for law enforcement at the patrol level. Working for 5 years in patrol, and Julie, you can probably 9 years on patrol as well. You think about all the things that you missed on stops because you didn't know what you were looking for. And to me, that is important to train all of the officers to know what to look for, to know what questions to ask, how to move forward with an investigation. If I've got a car pulled over at 2 a.m. and I've got an older male and a younger female in this car, and they're in a park or they're, traveling somewhere and the stories are different, something's going on there. And that's where I think law enforcement needs to learn or needs to be trained on how to handle that stuff. I got a question once at a conference of how much training does law enforcement receive at the, when you're in skills and when you're in school towards trafficking? And the answer was none. It has only become a recent issue, or it has recently only become to light. And I think I'm trying to work forward and get that taken care of going to, there's a conference called the TZD conference, which is towards zero death. And I'm trying to put together an hour-long presentation for all of the traffic officers to learn what they're looking for and how to handle the situation, who to call. How do you get an advocate involved? What questions to ask to separate these people, to do some training so officers can move forward. There are programs in other states, in Colorado, I think Washington, and I believe Florida all have specific trainings for their law enforcement officers on trafficking at a traffic stop level. And I think that's something that Minnesota is lacking and needs to be addressed. So that's one of the things that I've been working on towards, along with all the other hats that I wear. So those are the ones that I have currently. So
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those couple initiatives. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of the panelists to answer this question, but I think it's really important to hear from Juliet on maybe some of the initiatives that are being created under your leadership at the MMIR office.
Well, the report that was sent to the legislature, there's a call for action. There's the 20 mandates, and then trying to work with all of that and come up with some solutions is a little bit challenging. But right now I can hire 3 staff, and I looked at the different areas that I think would help the most. And a violence prevention coordinator who will be responsible for a community level response to MMRER violence is going to be one of the positions. And then also a community planner that will assist with the strategic goals, and then trying to make sure that we are following the strategic plan that the task force came up with. And then an intelligence specialist, and they'll be responsible for assisting with the collection and analysis and dissemination of MMR data. There are a lot of gaps in data. So having someone that can pull all that together, I think will make a difference. And then doing some crime mapping in GIS, where are the missings and the murders occurring? With having the law enforcement background, response time is huge. And so trying to figure out where this is all happening, I think will be beneficial to deploy resources. And then I've been visiting in the community, visiting with tribal nations and urban native community organizers just to get their feedback. And then also with the task force members, what is it that they want me to do? I'm a really good listener. And so getting all their feedback and kind of moving forward is really important to me. And then I'm also in the process of developing an advisory council, and the advisory council will come from task force members, and then I'll also be recruiting tribal nations representatives, and also from the urban native communities, and then getting together and then talking about how we're going to move forward. Like I said, it is something that we have to do as a community, and it's a restorative justice process. And so that's the way I'm looking at it, a holistic approach and a multifaceted approach. And so that's my job, is reaching out and trying to get the community to help me move forward with this work.
Miigwech, I know that we didn't get to John and Allison, but I really hope that, by bringing all of you together, that again, right, we can listen to one another. This moment in time, we shouldn't lose the momentum on this moment that we're creating right here. We have people from the federal level, Allison, right, being able to listen to what's happening right now in our community, being able to listen to the tribal police officer's perspective, being able to listen to the data guy, being able to listen to Juliet, the new executive director. Like, all of these moments really matter. And again, listening is so important in all of this. And so now I'd like to transition to any questions that either in person to all of you here, and then also virtually. Miigwech.
First, we're going to go to some Zoom questions that Anne, for the folks joining us on Zoom, that Anne will share.
Is it working?
Okay, the first question says, Minnesota is a public law 280 state. So when a woman is reported as missing and crosses jurisdictional boundaries such as North Dakota or South Dakota, under the Major Crimes Act, the FBI has jurisdiction. Has legislation been changed, or perhaps a memorandum of agreements established for the jurisdictions that are non-PL 280 so they may share data and information? Furthermore, are there state laws created concerning jurisdiction and information sharing at the federal, state, tribal, or municipal level?
I will share one very quick piece from public health. When we were writing the MMIW report, there was a flurry of activity as we were coming down as to whose statistics were we going to use in the report, the Department of Public Safety statistics or the Minnesota Department of Health statistics. And one of the things that is different about public health statistics versus criminal justice focuses on where the deaths occurred. So if you look at MMIW deaths, they will look at those that occurred in Minnesota. What public health does is that we use residents. So we look at where did the Minnesotans, or how many Minnesotans died, regardless of what jurisdiction that it occurred in. And so we ended up using the public health statistics because one of the aspects of human trafficking is that a lot of people get trafficked out of state and they may end up dying out of state. And so the numbers that really told the story were coming from the Department of Health. And the agreement that exists at the national level for that is called STEVE, the State and Territorial Exchange of Vital Events. We do have this agreement. in place, and we have just this last year got worked with our legal office to make sure that our the Injury and Violence Prevention section has access to the out-of-state deaths that occur to Minnesotans. We had to get legal approval on that with Steve, but that's an example in the public health realm of that multi-jurisdictional approach to counting some of this. And a similar kind of thing exists. We also look at non-fatal activity that occurs basically with hospital treatment. And we have exchanges most notably in place with North Dakota, but also working on this in some other states, Wisconsin being the next notable one, so that we can count activity that occurs to hospitals.
Thank you.
Question here.
Yes, I would like to hear repeated once again that there is no 24-hour waiting period, because within 24 hours, someone could be already gone to us. Would you repeat that, please? That there is no 24-hour waiting period.
There is no 24-hour waiting period.
We have a question online kind of in regards to that, and I know it's been touched on already, but this question says, is that requirement to take and act on a missing person's report a law? Or if not, why and where is the requirement?
Is that, I didn't hear the whole, is there, it is Minnesota state statute. It is in Minnesota state statute that law enforcement officers are required to take a report. And if you look at the statute, it clearly, there's no excuse. There's no excuse. They have to take a report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm almost 70 next month. And when I go downtown, I see a lot of desperate people, and I've taken in desperate people into my home, and it has, there's been all the social problems, that can happen. I just can't do it now. And where do if I see desperate people, all the problems of homelessness and all that, where do I go? Where do I send them, or what do I do? I'm really concerned. The poverty downtown is just phenomenal. I mean, you see these young kids, it's 11 o'clock at night. Not that I go out at 11 o'clock at night very often, but I'm sometime in transit. But anyway, I just don't know what to do.
The Minnesota Safe Harbor program does provide services for those under the age of 25. So as you talk about the youth, so that's for people who are being sexually exploited, or even at risk of being sexually exploited. Homelessness is a risk factor for sexual exploitation. So the Minnesota Safe Harbor program is a place for referral. Safe Harbor. Yeah. I can't answer any question on that.
Hi, hello. I just want to echo a little bit what Juliet said, and talking about how a lot of these efforts are because of continued colonization and structural racism within the systems. But also, I think working and trying to understand the data too is important at how these systems perpetuate disparities within their systems. So like, for instance, working with youth who are running away and their connection to foster care systems. I don't know, just from working with high-risk youth and trying to call and put in a complaint based on just because I know the value of their experience, and I know that the collective value of that experience is important, so that we can develop and change systems, right? But like currently there's no real, I'm sorry, I'm glad Carrie's on here. But there's no real way to, you can't call and place a complaint, right? A youth who's had a bad experience within the foster care system there's nowhere to tell that story to. So we're not even looking at that data. And one of my friends was a guardian ad litem, and she said, the kids in the system right now, that's our future murdered and missing. And because we're not looking at their stories or looking at the grievances or like what's happening to them, why are they on the run, what's happening to them in that home, it's really hard for community members who are doing this work to make informed decisions because we're not being able to look at that data. My other point is for you, the epidemiologist, Brian, is that your name?
John.
John,
That's Brian, I'm
dang.
John.
It's
Close.
always one or the other.
I'm the one that had to Google what epidemiology was.
I get white guys confused all the time.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
I'm sorry, just kidding. No, but John, I just want to really, I have my MPH and I'm real public health oriented. And one of the important things to mention when we're talking about that small n, that small number, is connecting it back to the reason why Native people, we used to be 100% of the population on this continent. And because we're only less than 1%, without having a direct conversation about and mentioning, and this will probably be good for your future when you're having to duke it out with other scholars who don't want to look at the importance of the disparity rates within our communities, is always mentioning never not talk about the fact that we were 100% of the population without talking about erasure and colonization and genocide. And the fact that like the current MMIWRP is connected to all of that. And so like, that's important. My question for you is, on your one committee, when you're looking at the deaths and stuff, are there community members? Are there Native people a part of that community or a committee? And also, could there be value and should there be a specific community looking at the deaths of Native women in Minnesota? Just like we did with the infant mortality, we had an American Indian infant mortality review that had community members as a part of it. So I was that's kind of like two questions, and maybe you guys are figuring that out right now. Miigwech, thank you.
So you and I have never met before, right? Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So but one of the things that we are trying to do, you talked about stories and trying to capture the stories. And one of the things that was real clear with some of the testimony when we had the MMIW task force were stories like this one person in the public comment session, she shared, she has been gone for over a year. Feds called it a suicide. She was murdered. 4 kids, healthy, bubbly. Here to honor and remember her. They stole her truck and keys that night. I was told they found her hanging by her feet. They didn't investigate. And we heard these kinds of stories coming, during the testimony about how the official statistics did not really reflect that individual's death. And I'm just going, we have a methodology that can begin to capture this. And it's called RFA, Retrospective Fatality Analysis, which is conducting an interview with next of kin and other acquaintances so as to find the story. We don't directly have authority to change the official statistic in terms of what's on the death certificate. We do have an opportunity to capture the stories with our own fatality investigations at the Department of Health. We are able to utilize fatality reviews as part of this. Now, data that comes into the health department is oftentimes hard to get out because of the statutory privacy on that data. However, we are authorized to aggregate data. So we conduct fatality reviews like of about 5 individuals, get recommendations from those fatality reviews, utilize that with communities to figure out how to specifically address those recommendations that come out of the fatality reviews. We do have a methodology. We can do this. I am looking for more secure funding on this. We're doing it with kind of our existing piece right now, but we're utilizing this RFA. Also, it's been referred to as psychological autopsy. That's a rather invasive term and not probably totally reflective of the process. But I think we have something. And if you're a master's student, you need a project. If you're an MPH and you're looking for something, hey, come talk to me. I've got a card. We'll discuss some various projects that you might be interested in. So.
Yeah, we can do one more. Yep.
Okay,
Go
we'll do
ahead.
one more question.
Thank you all for your time and insights today. I was just wondering what, if any, violence prevention programs and strategies are currently in place to reduce people's likelihood of perpetrating violence or correct the behavior of known perpetrators.
Well, I can answer a little bit of that. I know that in visiting with the tribal nations and the urban native communities, there are violence prevention coordinators that do community outreach and help victims and their families. And I think there are a lot of programs out there, but I think there's a real push now for trauma-informed work that I hope with my violence prevention coordinator to get more of that type of training for victims advocates, trauma-informed training. And then just so you know too, that the research on this topic is still ongoing. I'm working on a project description on where are the gaps in the systems. And so I'm just putting that together, the project description and the deliverables, and we'll be asking research organizations to take a look at it and see if they're willing to help with this work to help us move forward. And one of the biggest things that I'd like to see is a protocol. As an officer way back when, things that work are protocols. The domestic abuse protocol worked. And so if you can tell people what to do and how to do it, it's very helpful. And so developing that protocol to include prevention, reporting, and response for law enforcement in the community and violence prevention coordinators, I think is going to be huge. So that's one of my next steps. I hope to have something in place by this summer where we can hire a research group to come in and help us with those next steps.
Miigwech, I wanted to thank you all for engaging in this, lively discussion, for the laughter that we were able to share. Laughter is one of our medicines as Indigenous people. Also would like to thank the panelists for joining us. And I really hope that we as policymakers, we as, change makers and these kinds of things really take this discussion with us into the future. Really think critically about the questions and concerns that the community has arisen today, because, we do have the power within these systems to make change. I would like to put in a plug for the research that I'm currently a part of, the Truth Project. We're looking at the way in which the University of Minnesota has really been a colonial institution and has really been at the center of all of these disparities that we as Indigenous peoples face. And so the more that we can come together to push these systems, to advocate for change, the better it is for our future generations, for our babies. I hear that little baby up there crying, and it's just such a beautiful sound to have that in this space. And so again, miigwech, all of you, for joining us today. And I hope that we continue this momentum into the future to changing the systems. Miigwech.